On today's show, how concerned should we be about AD's potential return this season from his injury? And why is Kyrie Irving's injury not an overuse injury? And it could be an 8 to 12 month recovery time for Kyrie. We talked to Brian Sutterer, a sports medicine doctor, on all that and more on today's Locked On Mavs.
I'm going to get a city like that.
Dogs, all of us, all five.
You are Locked On Mavs, your daily Dallas Mavericks podcast.
No one's dying.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
Still can't leave me alone.
Your team every day.
Gotta be born with it, dogged up.
Welcome, you're locked on to the Dallas Mavericks, your team every day. My name is Nick Angstadt, media member covering the Dallas Mavericks for 10 years and the channel manager of Locked On Podcast Network. Thanks for being an everyday or making Locked On Mavs your first listen. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. Check out FanDuel. Get $200 in bonus bets for your first $5 bet wins. FanDuel.com. Today's episode, I'm joined by Brian Sutterer. He's a sports medicine doctor, and he knows so much about this. He's not a Twitter doctor. He's an actual doctor, real one. He's got a great YouTube channel, and we're going to talk about Kyrie's injury. There's a lot of talk about his minutes and his minutes load and how people thought, oh, well, it was just an overuse injury, but that's not the case with this one specifically. And we talk about the timeline. When could Kyrie actually come back? We talk about Dereck Lively and his ankle fracture and why is he wearing a boot? Is he not wearing a boot? What does that mean for him? His timeline, why was it so broad for him? But we start with Anthony Davis, so let's get into it. My conversation with Brian Sutterer, MD, about the glut of Mavs injuries right now. All right, I'm here with Brian Sutterer, MD, sports medicine doctor, and just an incredible YouTube channel. Great resource for anybody that wants to know more about the human body, anatomy, how sports interacts with injuries, and all that kind of stuff. Great stuff. Brian, thanks for hanging out with us today. You're here for a reason. The Mavs have so many injured players right now. We're trying to make sense of anything that's going on with this Mavs team right now. So let's start with Anthony Davis.
Nobody ever wants to talk to me when it's good news. It's always, hey, it's bad news. Let's talk to Brian and see what's going on.
That's true.
Nobody comes to see me when they feel good. It's always bad news. It's just okay. That's the life of being a doctor.
Maybe you transition to like the sports science thing. Remember the sports science show where they're like, this guy jumped 40 inches. You know, it's like,
we put chainmail on Jason Tatum and he jumped less.
Could do that instead. Yeah. That's some positive stuff. But with Anthony Davis, what's an abductor strain? Just explain it generally in what he's going through right now with this injury.
Yeah, and you got to be careful when you spell it. So adductor, ADD, because there's a different abductor, ABDUCTOR. So it's funny, like if you think back with Davis, right? The Lakers were calling it an ab strain, and we all thought like, oh, ab muscle, like right, your six-pack muscles. And then after he re-aggravated it, then it came out as this adductor, ADD. And so the adductor muscles are the groin muscles. It's the muscles on the inside of your thigh that when you squeeze and activate them, they bring your legs together. The abductors, ABD, those are like your glute muscles on the side of your hips that swing your legs out. So kind of different locations. So the adductor muscles, right, LeBron now dealing with one, we typically think of those as like a groin strain. But the one variation with those specific muscles, you know, a typical calf strain, right? It's the calf muscle. It's kind of one spot, more or less all the same. The adductors, the groin muscles, there's a big difference if it's in the muscle or if it's way up near the pelvis where that tendon comes off of the bone. And so, you know, your listeners have probably heard of like a sports hernia, or a better term is probably a core muscle injury. So there's a part of the body anatomically where the ab muscle comes down and the adductor groin muscle comes up, and they sort of overlap with one another right in front of the pelvis on a spot called the pubic bone. So if you push down below your abdomen, you'll feel this hard kind of bump bone there. That's your pubic bone, and it's where your abductor, your muscle. I did it myself. Where your ab muscles are coming down and inserting, and the adductors are coming up as well. When that sort of connection between those two muscles gets torn or injured, that's what we would call the proper term is core muscle injury, but you'll hear it described as a sports hernia or athletic pubalgia. And that has a little bit of a different treatment, a different management plan compared to just your run-of-the-mill muscle groin strain, just because of the overlap with the core muscles in the abs. And I don't think they've ever really come out and said anything with AD about like core muscle injury. I think there was some mention of that maybe early on being potentially involved. So that's the difference. Is it up there where those tendons come off the bone near the pelvis, or is it way down in his leg? And I think just based on where he was grabbing when he re-aggravated it, it's up near the front of the pelvis. And so it's just the rehab timelines are going to be a little bit different, much more likely to go on to a surgical type of management than just your run-of-the-mill muscle groin strain or ab strain. But interesting, right, that was potentially what was going on before he was traded. It was just being called an ab strain instead of like a groin, and then he gets hurt, and then the Mavericks staff is calling it an adductor. So yeah, it just shows you some of the variability potentially in how different medical staffs will characterize kind of injuries in the same area.
One of the things we were waiting on from him is if he was going to need surgery or not. It seems like he's avoided that. They're talking about him potentially returning, and so what, if it means he's avoided surgery, what does that mean for him? When would he have needed surgery, I guess?
Yeah. So, we think about all these injuries like grade 1, 2, 3 in general, right? Like a grade 1 is going to be just a little small partial tear versus a grade 3 where there's like a big full thickness disruption. So based on the initial injury, if he would have had on imaging like a big grade 3 tear, full disruption, we probably would have not even heard about the potential for rehab only. They probably would have just said, hey, season's over, he's going to have a surgery and be done with this. So that tells me that the injury severity is probably more on that grade 1, grade 2 side, where you can attempt to treat it with rehab only, but there's always that possibility on the back end that either at some point along the rehab progression or when you return to play, you either re-aggravate it or it doesn't heal as quickly as you would expect. And then that's when you would think about the potential for surgery. So the fact that we didn't hear about surgery right away is good, but there still is this potential that as he comes back, if he re-aggravates it, then you might need to think about a surgery. The good thing is like these types of surgeries aren't big, long, severe absences. And so even if he had to have a surgery like later on in the spring or into the regular season or something like that, I would fully expect him to be ready to go next season. This isn't like what we'll talk about with Kyrie in terms of length of absence. This is something that I think they've got a little bit of a window, which is probably part of why they're also trying to do the rehab route. Like eventually they'll get to a time point where you've either got to say, okay, surgery to get back for next year, or we're doing great. And I think he's still in that window of giving him the chance to recover because a lot of these will get better on their own. It just often takes more time than what you can afford in the middle of a season. But now they have the time to give him to try and adequately recover from it.
We think they have the time. They may push it.
Yeah.
Do you think him rushing back at all? Because it seemed like he kind of rushed back, really went hard that first game. Do you think that had anything to do with him re-aggravating it?
Yeah, I think it's possible. And you always wonder in these trades like how much is shared in terms of the medical information.
Well, the Quinn,
if I'm on
Caleb Martin,
we
had that where they had to give
right.
More
if I'm
had to give more picks.
Yeah, exactly. So if I'm on the Mavericks medical staff and I'm trading for a player who has been just diagnosed as an ab strain, like I'm not going to think twice about that. I mean, that's a very minor, no big deal thing. But if I hear that a player's had like one of these core muscle sports hernia injuries, that sort of piques my interest more. And like, okay, how bad was it? Can I see the imaging? How's he doing? So you wonder like what the communication was in the middle of that. Like, did they review it extensively? Did they just say, well, it's Anthony Davis. Like, we don't really care what the medical show. And then come back. And with a lot of those types of injuries, basketball is not a sport where you put a lot of demand on that part of the tissue. Like this is a way more common injury in soccer, hockey, football, sports where your legs are like going out a lot wider pretty regularly. And so it's not an injury that you'd like aggressively stress a lot in just like regular running up and down the court play for a big man. So he probably felt pretty good. And then you get back out there, right? The adrenaline's going, it's your first game. And, it looked like a pretty mild tweak, I will say. It wasn't like a big stretch that re-aggravated it. So I bet a lot of it was kind of lost in that rehab transition from what he was doing and how he felt with the Lakers medical staff to now like, okay, we've got, a handful of days to evaluate you ourselves and figure out where to go. I think that probably contributed to some degree.
They have talked about him potentially returning and that he could return by the end of the season. The Mavs seem like they're stuck in this 10th seed and the Suns don't want to take it at all. So we'll see what happens with them. But what are the risks for him returning potentially this season?
Yeah, it'd be the same as, that possibility that he re-injures it. And I think to some degree, right, you don't know until you get out there how it's going to feel. You try to progress him through every scenario in a safe, controlled manner to test all those positions, to see how he feels, to see how he responds. But all it might take is one bump, one contact, one crazy fluke play, like what happened with Kyrie. And next thing you know, you've injured it worse, and now you're having surgery. I will say the only benefit is, again, that timeline for surgery is not that long. And so you've got the availability to sort of play with it a little bit to see how he does coming back. And then it comes down to the team, right? If they're in the thick of things and they want to try and push and they're going to have those conversations about risk, reward, and try and go because they're maybe in the play-in, great. But I'd imagine if they were well out of it, they probably aren't going to push it that much, hopefully.
And that's where we kind of hope that they that they go, because I don't know what there is to really play for the Mavs. Coming up, Kyrie Irving is 33 years old and he's a small guard. How does that change his recovery and his rehab time from his ACL injury? We'll talk about all that and more with Brian coming up in today's Locked On Mavs. Today's episode of Locked On Mavs brought to you by Wayfair. They have everything you need. I've used Wayfair before. I've got a drink cabinet in my living room that is just awesome. I got it. It's the exact color that I wanted. It got shipped for free. It was awesome. Your home should reflect your style with Wayfair. It's easier than ever to make that happen, just like I did. Whether you're looking for a simple refresh or tackling a big home project, Wayfair has everything you need in one place. Wayfair's huge selection makes it easy to find the perfect piece no matter your space or budget. From cozy furniture and stylish decor to kitchen essentials and outdoor must-haves, Wayfair has it all. And all at prices that'll fit your budget. Easy shopping and delivery. The site made it so easy to compare styles. My order arrived fast and free delivery, which is always awesome. Head over to wayfair.com. Find something that's just your style today at Wayfair, WAYFAIR.com. Every style, every home. Also brought to you by TurboTax. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money back. Then it was waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, and everything with 100% accuracy. Also, you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worrying. Now this is Taxes. Get an expert now at TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live. Full service, real-time updates only on iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. You mentioned Kyrie. So one of the big talking points after the injury happened was about the amount of minutes that he was playing. And I saw even you were commenting on it. We were messaging about it because it made sense in my mind that if he played a lot more minutes, that he would be straining his muscles more and be more susceptible to an injury. Why was the ACL injury not an overuse injury?
Yeah, boy, I don't think I've been as hot and frustrated on X as all the comments I was getting about that. And it's so hard to get the minutia of some of this across. So if you just Google, like, is fatigue related to risk of an ACL tear? Yes, like you will see broad strokes. Yes, fatigue can contribute to an ACL tear because your muscles are the external active stabilizers to help do what the ACL is doing passively inside the joint. And so if it's at the end of the game, you're dealing with a hamstring injury, your muscles are fatigued, you don't have that same neuromuscular control to stabilize and protect. But that's in the case of like your non-contact cut, pivot, change directions situation, not when you get bumped and your knee hyperextends and your joint bends beyond the normal range and it just snaps the ligament. Like, there's no amount of muscle strength or rest or anything that would have prevented his knee from hyperextending in that circumstance. And it just hyperextended to the point where it tore the ACL. I mean, everybody remembers Giannis when he had his bad looking hyperextension in the playoffs a number of years ago and only missed like 10 days or something like that. So it's bad luck. It's a fluke. So people are right in that, yes, fatigue can play a role in ACL tears, but not this type of an ACL tear. So yeah, if this had been at the end of the game, his minutes had been up, it was your classic non-contact cut pivot. Sure, I think that would be something you could consider. But again, that only applies once it happens, right? Like, nobody complains about it in the moment. Nobody's complaining about his minutes until he gets hurt.
I was complaining about his minutes,
hurt. Were you? Well, I mean, most fans are probably not as mad, right? And then you get hurt. Oh, see, I told you so.
Yeah, right.
But in this case, you have to think of the difference between types of ACL tears. There's nothing you're going to do strength or stamina, et cetera, to limit the knee hyperextending like it did to tear his ACL. And so I think that's where you just have to draw the difference. And also, I mean, it was the beginning of the game, right? I mean, if this was like the end of the game, different situation, maybe more. But I think a lot of it, to be honest, is just frustrated fans who want to, understandably have some reason to, why did this happen? Why are we having such bad luck? And I get that. But you also don't want to, dog on people for something that they weren't at fault for. I don't think you can blame his minutes at all for that injury. And the other argument, of course, the more minutes you play, the more risk of getting hurt because you're on the court more, right? It's more exposure. But that doesn't equate. People were saying, well, duh, if you play more, you've got a higher chance of getting hurt. Well, yeah, but it's not. That's not like how the science works. So no, I don't think it played any role just because of that mechanism specifically.
Yeah, it mathematically gave him a higher chance of getting an injury because he was just out there more, and some of it was because he was driving more. He had to do more on offense after the Luke injury. So I guess you can draw some lines there. It was a real great narrative to be able to draw a line straight from the Luka trade to Kyrie's injury. But
I got a ton of engagement. Yeah, great for that.
Absolutely. The ACL timeline. I've heard 8 to 12 months. Why such a big range, and is that a correct range for something like this?
Yeah, that's a good range. It depends on a lot of different factors, and the early part of an ACL rehab is very similar no matter what surgeon, what type of surgery, et cetera, in terms of how long you're in a brace, crutches, that initial, month or two period. There are other factors that will play into that. I don't think we heard anything about like meniscus tearing, right? I mean, and there's a very real chance that he could have a meniscus tear in his knee as well that has to be addressed at the time of surgery. That wouldn't necessarily extend his rehab unless it was something major and unexpected, but could influence, how long we see him on crutches, that sort of thing early on. The whole back half of ACL rehab, though, is purely about trying to get back, number one, the strength in your muscles from how much they atrophy and get weak with the surgery, but then improving that control and stability to be able to protect your joint at a high level of that cut pivot. And that's where there's a lot of variability with just how each individual person heals and recovers, and then also what their sport demands are. So we all know, I think Adrian Peterson missed like 6 months or something with one of his ACL injuries. Yeah. And then we've seen other running backs take more than a year. That's not because like one surgery was better than the other. It's very, very much because of just that individual's healing potential and how quickly they were able to regain all that. And so basically the medical staff, the physical therapists, they're going to have a set of kind of objective criteria that you follow in terms of symmetry, one side to the other, with muscle function, balance testing. There's a whole lot of objective stuff they'll go through. And there's some rough markers for when you've, quote unquote, had successful testing in those regards, and then can ramp up to the next stage. So 8 to 12 months is a very appropriate range. In Europe, there's a big push, especially in soccer. Like you'll hear about 6-month return to play for ACL tears, which I think the majority of the orthopedic community thinks is complete nonsense. And I think it's being pushed that way because they just want to get people back sooner to, money and the financial implications of things. Everybody's very short-sighted with it. But if you were to poll, 100 orthopedic sports surgeons and say, hey, what would be the appropriate timeline? Yeah, 8 to 12 months is an appropriate timeline. So I think when you look at it, you then back out where that takes us in the next season. The All-Star break factors in there. I would plan on him, best case scenario, coming back around the All-Star break, if not after the All-Star break next year. And then it factors in, right, where's the team at? If the Mavericks are sitting in last place and there's 2 months left of the season, you're probably not going to push back for those last 2 months, but that doesn't mean that your rehab was unsuccessful. It just means, risk benefit of coming back for 2 months versus having an additional 4 to 6 months. So those will be the factors, but you never know, man. He could heal heroic and be ready to go come Christmas time, and that'd be okay too. I think you just have to have the confidence that they're following those objective testing markers and progressing him appropriately.
Yeah, that 6-month timeline is wild. He would start the season if he did something like that.
That's absurd. I mean, it's just absurd. It's really funny, the difference between kind of here in the States and over in Europe, and very high rate of repeat tearing when you come back too soon, just because of how long it takes for the graft to kind of reincorporate and heal. And because you can run like 6 months after an ACL, like you're running, you're jumping, you're doing a lot. And so you can kind of squeeze and get by. But yeah, I would not expect that at all for him.
Right. For him, he's 33. We hear about, oh, he's an older, small guard. How does that change rehab for an injury like this, or does it? I mean, or is it just like another narrative that people bring up?
Yeah, I think it does change things just in the setting of what fans and the team have to have in terms of their expectations, right? The sports media has kind of done a disservice to fans because every time somebody gets injured, it's always the same press release, right? We expect a full recovery. Surgery went great. We expect a full recovery. And like you always expect somebody to have a full normal recovery, right? When a surgeon operates on an ACL, they always say, yeah, well, we expect you're going to do great. But the reality, if you actually look at large populations of athletes and the data, not everybody does great. There's a decent percentage of people that do not return to their previous level of performance. Getting back to your sport is one thing, but we also look at performance, and there's a difference in just getting back to basketball and getting back to your prior level of performance, no matter what the surgery. If it's a baseball pitcher with a UCL tear, there's a big difference between being able to come back and pitch and being able to come back and throw 99 and have control versus throwing 90 with less control. So that's the reality that you just have to be prepared for. And then as you age, your tissue doesn't heal as well. The biomechanical properties of your ligaments and tissues change naturally over time with age. And so, yeah, I think you just have to be cautious when you come back. And I think for fans to say, oh yeah, I mean, the team said he's going to make a full recovery and he's going to be great and he's going to be the Kyrie of old. Yeah, we hope so. But if you take 100 Kyrie Irvings and tear their ACL, not 100 of them are going to come back as the same Kyrie Irving. And so you have to at least be understanding of that possibility, hope for the best, but not be shocked if there is some, gradual, there's some people who think it should be a 2-year recovery for an ACL tear.
Yeah, right.
Because of that time to get back to performance. It was a big talk with Klay Thompson, right? So you just have to be prepared for that. Now we hope for the best, but that doesn't mean that it's a guarantee that, he's going to step on the court and be the Kyrie of 10 years ago, day one.
Yeah. So, I mean, people say it's a 2-year injury where the second year is when they come back, and that's when they're fully back and fully back to the player that they are, which is.
And that's that return to performance piece. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
That's the, you're back to your sport, but your sport is the 1% of the 1% that's playing at a high level, and you're even above that 1%. Yeah. And when you're really trying to push, and I mean, that's where it's tough, right? It's easy to get somebody back from an ACL rupture to normal daily life. It's hard to get them back to college It's even harder to get them back to all-star level point guard. And that's just, that's the reality of it that you have to at least be kind of open to.
Coming up, Dereck Lively has a right ankle stress fracture. What does the boot mean? When he's wearing a boot, when he's not wearing a boot, what does that mean for him? Is it a good sign or a bad sign? We talk about all that and more with Brian coming up. Today's episode of Locked On Mavs brought to you by Skims. Skims has men's clothing now. They sent me some underwear. It's great. I'm actually wearing them right now because they sent me a pair and it's great and I love them and I bought more because they have everything you need. They fit, comfort, just finding the right style for me. Skims changed everything. Their men's line offers something for everyone from boxer briefs to classic briefs, all designed with the perfect balance of comfort and style. I can attest, my butt can attest. I tried Skims and I'm hooked, and I went and got back more. Shop Skims men's at skims.com/lockedonnba, and at Skims stores you can get them as well. They obviously have lots of women's clothing and things, so if you want to get them for gifts or just get them for yourself and feel that comfort that you need, shop Skims men's at skims.com/lockedonnba and let them know that we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select our show in the drop-down menu that follows. So go there, skims.com/lockedonnba. Well, I wish those were the only two injuries we had to talk about, but there are way more we can get into.
Yeah, it's a long list.
Let's keep going down the list. Dereck Lively, right ankle stress fracture. At first, I thought it was reported as like a foot injury. Then it became an ankle. What is the difference for a big man, especially from having some kind of foot fracture or like an ankle fracture? Because it seems like the ankle one is way better.
Yeah, there's a big difference. Anywhere in the body, we classify stress fractures as either high risk or low risk in the sense of chance to heal and risk of complications. So, for example, we've heard of like a Jones fracture, right? So there's a spot on that fifth metatarsal bone in the foot where the blood supply is not as good as other parts of the bone, and that's a higher risk location to have a fracture. So depending on the location, foot or ankle, influences the high or low risk nature of the injury. And so you could have a low risk foot stress fracture that's overall a better prognosis than a high risk ankle stress fracture. So, for example, the inner part of the heel bone, the medial kind of malleolus, it's called, the inner part of the heel is a spot where you don't want to get a stress fracture compared to the outer part of the ankle. And so even though they say ankle versus foot, you have to further look at, okay, what part of the ankle versus what part of the foot, because there's stress fractures in the foot that are very low risk. I mean, like you might be in a boot or off of it for a week or two, and then you're back pretty quick. And then there's other ones like the navicular bone that we've heard about in a lot of big men, where there's a pretty low threshold to have surgery, even if it's just a stress fracture, because of the decreased healing chance, most often related to blood flow. So without knowing specifically like what bone they're talking about, I mean, I don't know why they would change. It's kind of weird to like report it as a foot and then call it an ankle, because those are very, very, very different parts of the body. So yeah, unfortunately, just saying ankle versus foot doesn't really help. You need to know specifically what bone, and is it then like a high risk or a low risk location.
They originally said the timeline, or at least it was reported, was 2 to 3 months. That seems like that's such a broad range to me. Why do you think it was such a broad range for an ankle fracture?
Yeah, it's definitely a broad range, and I think with a lot of those, to me, that suggests that it's maybe more of a high risk location, because you're not going to have such a wide time range for a pretty low risk run of the mill spot. And so to me, that suggests, okay, maybe this was more of a high risk area where they were going to have to take it a little bit slow and give them a little bit more time. And that back half, it's kind of similar to like the ACL rehab that we think about. Okay, clearly that back half of the rehab is hard to predict, right? 8 months versus 12 months is a long time, but also 2 weeks versus 4 weeks. I mean, that's relative, same big difference amount of time. And it's so dependent on how everybody responds individually. You can have good healing in that bone where everything looks good on the MRI, the CT scan. But then when you try and get your conditioning back, your ankle is stiff, your foot is stiff, you can't run and jump at the same, clip that you need to where the injury has technically healed, but it's taking you longer to get back to your playing performance. So that's oftentimes where we see some of that, broader window factored in of like, hey, how long is it going to take them to get back to their sport beyond just the healing timeline? Because I think by now we probably would have heard if it wasn't going well and they were going to have to think about a surgery. So to me, that suggests that things seem to be healing at a good rate.
Yeah, just like in the surgery PR note that you said, they expect a full recovery. I've said to all these guys, AD, Lively, Gafford, all progressing well. There's showing great progress. It's like, okay, well, I don't know what level that is.
Yeah, right.
He could return this season. Should he? Like, what are the risks of returning if he can?
Yeah, so the big one would be like a risk of re-injury, and a big way that they're going to track the healings is with repeat imaging. And so not only, in kind of your common situation, right? If you or I went in and we had a stress fracture, they're not going to get a new CT scan every 3 weeks to look at it. We're going to follow pain. We're going to follow symptom progression with activity. In his case, they're probably doing regular imaging to check and actually see, okay, how much does the bone look like it's healing? Because you can see pretty well on imaging how much, bone has healed. Is there still a fracture line there? But there can be a little bit of a window there where it looks like it's healed pretty well on the imaging, but the bone is not structurally as strong as it was before. Or what can happen, we saw with Zion, right? You remember he had that fracture in his foot and kind of came back and then re-injured it and had to have more stuff done. Sometimes it can look like the fracture is healing, something what we call a union of the fracture, when in reality it sort of sputters out and then almost becomes like what you call like a fibrous union, where instead of good solid bone forming across it, it's almost like scar tissue that's formed across the bone, where it might look like it's healed pretty well. Pain might not be so bad, but then once you ramp it up and you're playing like NBA level minutes, you start having more pain and it becomes apparent that, okay, maybe this isn't actually healed. So that's the main risk, is that you're going to come back before that bone is actually as strong structurally as it needs to be, despite what the tests look like. And then the reason they go through all the other rehab is, right, if your muscles have gotten weak, you want to make sure you don't tear your ACL or do something like that when you're coming back to play when you've been out for so long. So that's equally part of it, is making sure the rest of his limbs and the rest of his body are where they need to be when you get back into that level.
There's been a lot of fan talk about, well, he's in a boot or he's not in a boot. Oh, it's good to see Lively not in a boot, and then he'd be in the boot again. Is there anything to that, or is the boot just a precautionary? He wears it whenever he's going to be around people. You know what I mean?
Boot could be. Yeah, I remember they kind of fooled me with that with Luka, because I think we saw Luka still in a boot at a game, a Mavs game.
Yeah,
and it was pretty far out from his injury. And I was like, whoa, he's still in a boot. This must not, be going as well as we'd expect. But in reality, there are situations as you're, the boot is not just for the healing necessarily. If you're in an environment where there's a higher risk that somebody's going to push you and you're going to stumble and fall, or you're walking a really long distance, yeah, you might put the boot on just temporarily, right, to kind of help during those short time windows. So, ideally, yes, the typical progression is initially you're in a boot, you then start wearing the boot less and less, but that might be you're in the boot for 90% of the day and you come out of it for 30 minutes. It might be then eventually that you're only in the boot for an hour and you're out of it the rest of the day, but we just happen to see that hour when you're, at the game and being photographed. So I wouldn't read too much into that. Now, if you see him on crutches, okay, that would be a concerning kind of step backwards if suddenly we see him show up on crutches one day. But just the kind of boot back and forth, to me, wouldn't really mean all that much right now.
On to Daniel Gafford, continuing on our list. Right knee sprain. He last played February 10th. He's going to be reevaluated in about a week and a half or so. What are they looking for when he gets reevaluated?
So number one, if I recall, I think he was did he have an MCL sprain? I think that was sort of at least from looking at the mechanism, that seemed to be what I would suspect they're dealing with here. So number one, when you're treating something like an MCL sprain or any sprain around the knee, which would imply, a ligament type of injury, number one, you want to make sure when you manually stress that ligament, like push on the knee to try and stretch it, that it's not moving and that they don't have pain. So day one, when this injury happens, docs get in there, they're stressing that ligament, they're pushing on his knee a certain way. When it's sprained, it probably stretches, so they feel some movement and it hurts. That is how you diagnose on your exam that there's been a sprain. As it heals, it stiffens back up to where now when you push on it, it's not moving, but also it's not hurting. And so the first sort of clue that things are healing well is to repeat your exam. And okay, is the knee stable when we stress it? Is there pain when we stress it? No, great. No, great. Okay, now let's get back our range of motion. So step one, range of motion comes back. Step two, get your strength back. Step three, running, jumping. Step four, basketball specific activities. So that's what they're going to be monitoring with him periodically, is once everything feels stable, stressing the ligament, all right, let's start pushing a little bit more. And then you just see how his pain levels respond day over day until it gets to the point where he's doing everything he needs to do on the court. He's not having pain, no subsequent pain the next day. And you say, great, we're good to go. And there's some, rough time frames we know from literature and experience, depending on grade 1, 2, 3 and what ligament. So it seems like things are on track. I mean, February 10th, so about a month ago. That's pretty on par with something like a grade 2, potentially MCL sprain or ligament sprain around the knee.
There's so many other injuries. We could talk about them all day, I think, but go check out Brian's great YouTube channel. Good stuff all the time going over there. Not just NBA. I can't watch the MMA ones. I just can't with somebody just like,
I don't do as many of those anymore, to be honest. It started to kind of get to me a little bit too. I don't watch it as much as I used to. Some of the personalities and the head injuries. Yeah, it even makes me feel a little bit uneasy at times now too. So yeah, it is a lot, unfortunately.
But go check out his great YouTube channel. Brian, thanks for hanging out with us.